Welcome to the Sound of Ideas Reporters Roundtable from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Mike McIntyre. So glad you're with us. Trump cabinet members praised Ohio leaders on a visit to the Columbus area yesterday, in which they announced a massive crackdown on Medicaid fraud and indictments against 14 people. Jail cameras should record what's happening behind bars, but cameras at the Cuyahoga County Jail weren't working properly. Officials knew it, but took 4 years to fix them, according to reporting from the Marshall Project Cleveland. Short-term housing rentals can be a neighborhood nuisance, so Cleveland City Council is cracking down, limiting their number, and increasing penalties for repeat offenders. And it was unofficial Devo Day as the local synth punk favorites electrified the Akron Civic Wednesday. 2 lawmakers want the state to designate an official Ohio Devo Day, April 18th, commemorating the band's first Kent State University show. Will the Rock Hall even notice? Joining me to whip the news of the week and whip it real good are IdeaStream reporters Matt Richman and Gabriel Kramer. Good morning, guys.
Morning, Mike.
Happy Friday, Mike.
And happy Friday to you as well. And at IdeaStream State House News Bureau in Columbus, a woman who swears that picture of her in college shows her wearing a Devo Energy Dome, not a lampshade. Bureau Chief Karen Kassler. Morning, Carol. Morning, Karen.
Good morning.
Good to have you with us.
It's Friday.
It wasn't
Happy
a lampshade.
Friday.
It was not a lampshade, right? It was a Devo Power Dome.
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, good. You can join us by emailing your thoughts, comments, or questions to soi@ideastream.org. And let's get ready to roundtable. Trump administration cabinet members and other federal and state officials railed against fraud of all sorts, and especially Medicaid fraud, during a press conference in Central Ohio yesterday. Among the presenters were acting U.S. Attorney General Todd Blanche, FBI Director Kash Patel, and Dr. Mehmet Oz, Administrator for the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. They announced the indictment of 14 people accused of fraud, mostly bilking Medicaid. Karen, this idea of fraud stealing taxpayer money has been on the radar for weeks now. So why the flex here from the Trump administration in Ohio?
Well, this was an interesting event because it had been billed as a press conference with Vice President J.D. Vance talking about federal enforcement actions. And Vance couldn't make it, but those folks that you just mentioned did. They were joined on the stage by the Republican office holders who are running for other executive offices this fall. I'm talking about Auditor Keith Faber, Secretary of State Frank LaRose, Treasurer Robert Sprague, and one office holder, currently Attorney General Dave Yost, who was actually speaking at the event. And they were kind of doing a mashup of all sorts of different fraud, not just Medicaid fraud, which we've been hearing a lot about because of this report in the Daily Wire about hundreds of millions of dollars in alleged Medicaid fraud with home health care providers in Ohio. The state still hasn't fully confirmed that yet. But there was also fraud related to COVID-19 funds and fraud on behavioral services money and even a romance fraud. So this was kind of a whole amalgamation of a lot of different fraud cases.
Yeah, the bulk of it, though, being Medicaid, and they talked a lot about that. There was one specific case involving behavioral health for children, essentially saying that they needed it, not delivering it, and there were 4 people arrested on that. What was seized were bank accounts and fancy cars, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think some of this is related to the things that we've been hearing about a lot about when it comes to fraud in government programs and Republicans' reaction to that. I mean, everybody admits, Republicans and Democrats, that there is fraud in programs like Medicare and Medicaid. But the question is, how do you fight that? And of course, in Ohio, Republicans have run the state since 2011. And so there have been some questions raised about, well, if this fraud has happened, it happened on Republicans' watch, so how are Republicans going to fix it? And state lawmakers have come up with some ideas, but this whole event, I think, was really to just kind of draw attention to the fact that there is this fraud happening, and you've got these law enforcement entities that are paying attention and throwing in details like luxury cars and diamond-encrusted jewelry and things like that. It really kind of ups the interest in it, but this stuff happens a lot.
It was interesting that you said that they were talking about Republicans would be responsible if there is fraud because they're in charge. And yet in this particular visit, it was praise for the Republican leaders of the state because they're doing such a great job of rooting out the fraud. So it seems like it's trying to counter that argument that you've been hearing from Democratic legislators that said, this is under your watch.
Yeah, this is kind of a fine line that Republicans are walking here because they have been in charge, but this also happened, or at least they're alleging that it happened. And so if there's going to be blame, the blame seems to have been thrown primarily on Governor Mike DeWine and his former Medicaid director, Maureen Corcoran. But then state lawmakers are also getting into this, saying that they're going to increase the penalties for Medicaid fraud and do some other things. There's a bill that's moving very quickly in the House and Senate because legislators are planning to go on summer break at the end of next week. And this bill would indeed increase penalties on Medicaid fraud. It would require electronic visit verification for home health care providers. And one thing that was added this week, which is especially significant, I think, is that they added a provision that would ban family members for getting Medicaid payments for caregiving. And that's a big issue for family members who care for disabled Ohioans and older Ohioans. Most of them do it without being paid, but the ones who do get some Medicaid funding for that, because they have to do this, they can't get jobs necessarily, they're very concerned about what the outcome will be.
Yeah, I know several people like that, and they would love to have a job and have their loved one be able to take care of themselves. They can't. In order to give them the kind of care they need, there's no way they could actually work. And so this compensates them for doing that. The idea was to take that away. And what we saw was a protest at the State House. There were people in wheelchairs that were filling the chambers. There's certainly a lot of angst about that particular provision.
Yeah, and I've talked to a couple of people who are in that situation who've reached out to me, so I'm hoping to put together a story on their situations, because there is a real concern about this, that if the fraud is happening, and, again, we acknowledge that the fraud is happening, just the level of it is the question. It seems to be happening mostly among administrators and companies rather than individuals. And individuals, especially in this case, who are caring for disabled Ohioans, really feel like they're being punished and they're getting their small payments cut off because of this alleged fraud that's happening, that's been kind of talked about for at least the last couple of weeks.
And you're saying there's an acknowledgement that there's Medicaid fraud. Of course, there's going to be some in any program. There's going to be some level of fraud. Democrats, though, are claiming the amount of fraud that the Republicans are trying to point to, it just isn't there, and that this is really just a political thing.
Yeah, I don't know that there's any evidence that waste, fraud, and abuse really add up to enough money that it would wipe out deficits and things like that, which you've been hearing Republicans talk about, how if they got rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, they could pay for all these other things. And that there, I don't think that there is enough evidence that supports that. Of course, Democrats have their own ideas about what could be done to crack down on fraud in Medicaid, and we're just going to have to wait and see with that, but it seems unlikely that any Democratic proposals will move forward, especially, like I said, since state lawmakers are getting ready to go on break, and this Medicaid bill that's out there is likely to move before that.
I really look forward to the story you're planning to do with the actual people affected by this. We'll certainly want to hear that.
And always glad to hear from anybody. If anybody wants to reach out and tell their story, I'd love to hear from them.
And how do they get in touch with you then, Karen?
Well, you can email me at kcasler@statehousenews.org, or go to our website, statenews.org, and my phone number's there. So Give me a call.
All right, great.
Text me, whatever.
More than 100 cameras at the Cuyahoga County Jail were discovered to be malfunctioning in 2022 because they were outdated and often paused or skipped frames. Officials knew they were glitchy, but it took 4 years to fix them, to update the cameras. And Matt, this was some great reporting from Doug Livingston at the Marshall Project Cleveland. And I want to know what exactly, first of all, was wrong with the cameras. How did it come to jail leaders' attention?
So the explanation from the county is that these 100 some odd cameras were not compatible with the server that was kind of collecting all the video. So when it went from the camera to the server, you were getting gaps in the footage. It would stop and start.
You'd have like a guard. You could see them here, and then suddenly they
they
teleport
would appear
across
somewhere
the room.
else. Yeah, and they said that was a problem, sort of like a problem with the way the footage was going from one place to another and the way it was being stored. What the reporting found first was that it came to light after there was a 2021 use of force incident and a lawsuit, and workers in the information technology department were looking for footage from it, and they found that there were these glitches with gaps in the footage, and this was it actually came to light and was shared in emails that were gotten by the Marshall Project in early 2022. It should be noted that this period of time was when all the focus was on getting a new jail built, and so the county says that they didn't find the money. It was $200,000, $220,000, I believe, right around there, $220,000.
Yep.
Yeah, and that they didn't find that money until late last year.
In the size of the county budget, couldn't find 220 grand?
Right. It was clear. It seems pretty clear it was not a priority to get these cameras replaced.
They were working, but not working fully.
Properly.
And so you weren't getting a full view. And then during that time, there were 17 incarcerated people who had died. So the idea is, you want to go back and look at that and make sure that they were checked on, or that whatever incidents might happen. And what they're finding is an incomplete picture.
Yeah. And I mean, there were a number of incidents from, 2024, from last year, where in a couple cases, it was people who had medical emergencies inside of cells. So the camera didn't actually see what happened to them inside the cell, but it did see that that the corrections officers, who were supposed to be making their rounds, and in one case it was every 30 minutes in the mental health unit, you didn't see what they were actually doing. You would see them arrive on the area where the cell was, and then there would be a gap, and then they would be in another part, or they would just be gone. And so the question is, it raised a question about whether they're able to hold corrections officers accountable for the way that they're, kind of taking care of people who are in there. And, and without accountability, and this is what some of the families are saying, without accountability for these officers, nothing's going to change.
We realize there's a new jail that's being built in Garfield Heights. It's going to be state of the art. I'm sure it'll have cameras that work. But in the meantime, 100 Sony cameras being replaced seems like something that's essential if you're going to keep a good monitor of the jail that you have, which is going to be in use for several more years.
Yeah, I believe the plan now is for construction to be completed in 2029. So there is work that's going to need to go on in the jail between now and then.
Indeed. Residents used as short-term rentals like Airbnb or Vrbo must register with the city and follow other rules instituted by Cleveland City Council this week. And Gabe, council members have been getting plenty of complaints in neighborhoods saying these places are nuisances. We've heard a little bit of a drumbeat about what they might do. Monday, they finally took action. What did they do?
So they have restrictions. You have to register with City Council to be a new person who runs an Airbnb or a Vrbo, one of these temporary short-term rental units, and there are some more rules you have to follow. And we were hearing a lot of complaints from people. Councilmember Chris Harsh was talking about how, if you're living in a neighborhood, you don't really want to have people coming in and out. You don't know who your neighbors are on a weekly, daily basis. And, the people change. I mean, it could be people there for a large gathering. It could be someone there for a quiet weekend, and you don't really know who's going to be next to you. And that's what people are complaining about. And, so there are some rules that they're going to have to follow. And if, they kind of created this 3-strike rule where if you, as an owner of an Airbnb or a Vrbo, have 3 or more nuisance incidents in a year's time, they will revoke your license to run that property. But they can take immediate action for something more serious, like a 1-strike rule if you have a case of disorderly conduct, assault, or weapons violations.
Okay. And what about density? You don't want to live in a neighborhood where everything is an Airbnb, because then all your neighbors are moving in and out, so they want to limit that.
Right. And it's going to be tough to measure this, whomever is the person that's going to have to monitor this. But, the rule is no more than 10% of a residential block of a multi-unit building may be made up of short-term rentals. So Councilmember Jasmine Santana said that this means 3 to 6 houses per street at most. Streets are different sizes in Cleveland. 10% can vary, but that's kind of how they're approximately measuring this.
And then we're also going to talk about that some people at this council session were saying this isn't necessary, that this is attacking the businesses, the people that own these Airbnbs, and that there are already rules against big parties and those types of things, but this is going to be harmful to them. Council clearly did not side with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm reading some of the reporting by Abby Marshall, one person speaking up and talking about how, there are, they house people who are here for a funeral and the whole family wants to be together at one time, and, it's more comfortable than a hotel. And that might be true, but at the same time, you're also having people who are, taking advantage of these and throwing parties and getting in trouble
coming for
these
a Guardians
things.
game for the weekend, and then
Right.
everybody's out and
Yeah,
not
they're
behaving
having
themselves.
Exactly. So I mean, I think for every instance of someone coming here for maybe a right reason, there's a lot more instances that council's worried about where it's the opposite. But even still, I think to the point of council, what they're saying is, this, it's just not how they want the neighborhoods formed. They want the neighborhoods to be people that they know and feel comfortable with on a more regular basis.
It's great to have all kinds of new regulations and laws about every kind of thing, but you then have to enforce it.
Yeah.
And so what's the plan here, and do they acknowledge that this is a very difficult thing to enforce?
They acknowledge it's a very difficult thing to enforce, and council basically saying, like, we understand that this is going to be hard, and they still have to figure out how they're going to go about this. But they said that this is a start. This is the starting point for whatever they'll have to figure out to keep people in line. Because the person who spoke at council on Monday saying that this is hurting us as business owners, or they're saying, like, you're hurting the community. You're forcing people to go to hotels, which are often owned by, whatever big brands, and you're hurting these local business owners. But even he couldn't admit that he wouldn't even be upfront about whether or not he was someone who lived in the city or not. So a lot of these properties are perhaps owned by people out of town, like a lot of the landlords. So it's kind of like, the landlord issues and the Verbo issues and the Airbnb issues are kind of the same about who maybe owns those properties.
Okay, council was busy, Matt. It had, I think, an 11-hour marathon session. I know Abby was there and was like, this thing's going on forever. But in addition to the short-term rentals, they rolled back some of those new parking requirements. We talked about it a little bit last week, but now it's official. Tell me just a little bit about what the changes are with parking.
Yeah, so they had increased prices that started at the beginning of the year to $150 for the first 2 hours, and then it would increase up to $450. And this was for downtown
Per
and near
hour.
West Side per hour, and then there was a 4-hour limit, and they instituted Saturday enforcement. They rolled back the prices, and they took away the Saturday enforcement and changed it so basically, you can park all weekend for free now in these
In the
parts of town.
neighborhoods, not necessarily downtown. Downtown still has some requirement on that. But when you talk about the neighborhoods, that's not universally accepted. You would think, okay, great, it's free parking. The council member there would think that's a terrific thing. But we hear from Councilman Austin Davis that it's not great to have free parking on Saturday around the West Side Market. You want to have churn. You want to have people have to pay.
Yeah, that's one of the big things is that because there are so many people coming through on Saturdays, you want people having to go. And one of the big things is if you go down on Friday night, go bar hopping and then make your way somewhere else, and the night takes you wherever, you could leave your car on West 25th with these new rules and come pick it up Sunday night, not have to worry about a thing. And that's a problem for business owners there.
Actually, Gabe, I've bar hopped with you down there, and you don't bring a car.
Not me.
Not
but,
me either.
But it is a smart idea that if you have enough beers on a Friday, you might want to wait till Sunday. But now you have to have a plan B. And I think, maybe this will force people to have alternate routes, which I think is the people who are often advocating for more walkability, more access to transit, which means fewer parking spots. I think this is kind of that tactic of forcing people to think about alternatives to just leaving a car parked somewhere.
Another quick thought about changes. Downtown, I mentioned it still is Saturday enforcement, but they had Sunday enforcement as well. They've lifted that. You can park for free downtown on Sundays.
Yes, and there's some other changes as well. They're going to lower the price a little bit for downtown parking.
Yeah, it's like up to $3 rather than $4.
Right. And they're going to bring back a way to pay with cash or coin for those who would prefer that. And what Abby Marshall even told me is that Chris Harsh actually talked about the idea of maybe one day the city will consider creating its own app for people to pay for parking rather than using Park Mobile, which I used an hour ago.
Yeah, people don't like that because it's basically registering where you are with your car
Right.
with an outside agency. There's all kinds of issues with that. They get a small percentage of each one of the parking things as well. I'm glad they're bringing back a way to pay with coins because I still have a yogurt container full of quarters.
Yeah.
And I don't know what else to do with
You
them.
collected them for that moment.
They're in the car for that
They
very
took the
reason.
moment away.
I've got a washing machine. I don't need it for that.
Yeah.
All right, fair. The Ohio Supreme Court this week reinstated the murder conviction of the motorist who hit and killed a Cleveland firefighter responding to an accident on I-90 in 2022. Leander Bissell's conviction had been overturned by the 8th Ohio District Court of Appeals after he successfully argued he didn't have an intent to kill, a requirement of a murder conviction. But Matt, Bissell was driving 49 miles an hour, wove around a police blockade before he hit Tetrick. What did the Supreme Court say about that in terms of intent?
Yeah, that was really interesting that they said that, you don't have to say that a person meant to harm anyone. You just have to say that they took actions that they knew would probably, or they had to know would probably hurt somebody. and they saw this as really meeting that threshold.
So if you're zipping around a blockade and there's cops there and they're saying stop and you're not and you run over somebody,
Yeah.
reasonably you could assume that those actions might have resulted in that, and therefore it meets the murder standard.
Yeah, and this was it's got a lot of attention among first responders, because this is one of those situations. It was not that long after the accident where it was not kind of well like the whole area was not clearly marked off, and there were people going through the partial block of the highway, and what they're saying is that even if it's maybe up for debate where exactly you're supposed to go, you need to be much more careful than this person was.
Yeah, 49 miles an hour is not going to cut. I can understand if you're crawling through and trying to avoid debris and that
and there
type of
was
thing.
footage of people doing that, but what this meant, it was very different than that.
Okay. Lawmakers are moving fast to put an amendment before Ohio voters that would enshrine a requirement for voters to show ID. Current law requires photo IDs, but they want it in the Constitution. Karen, the measure is Senate Joint Resolution 10. They advanced it really quickly.
Yeah, there's also House Joint Resolution 9, which is the same thing, but that has not advanced as quickly as the Senate version. So now the House has to take up the issue, and there has to be 3/5 support in both chambers for lawmakers to put this amendment on the ballot. There's no need for the governor to sign it. It goes to the ballot as soon as the House would get that 3/5 support. Now, the question is, do they have 3/5 support? Because there are some people who are kind of on the right-hand side of things who are concerned that this amendment does not require photo ID for mail-in voters. And so they say that that opens the door to voter fraud, which we know widespread voter fraud doesn't happen. It's not a thing. But there are people who are concerned that there might be that loophole there. And lawmakers say, the ones that are supporting it say that that's not an issue here. And they want to go ahead and put this before voters this fall.
It seems way easier to get an amendment on the ballot if you're the legislature than it does if you're the public.
Doesn't it? I mean, that's really kind of interesting, isn't it? Because there are no statewide signatures, nothing like that. So lawmakers can indeed come up with an idea and push it forward. And what's interesting about this, too, is that this is about the third time, I think, in recent memory, that lawmakers have put an amendment on the ballot that was something that was already in state law, but it was a big election year. In 2004, they put an amendment on to put the ban on same-sex marriage into the Constitution. And then in 2022, which was a year that we were also electing a senator and governor, same as we're doing this year, there was an amendment that would ban non-citizens from voting, which was already in state law, and that was put on the ballot as well as an amendment.
So it's basically a vote driver.
That's the question. Did it really drive votes in those cases? Because those were big election years. But that's a really good question. But it certainly adds attention to what we're going to be doing this fall anyway.
And to be clear, this involves in-person voting. It's not mail-in voting as well in terms of that constitutional amendment.
And that's the concern from certain folks on the right who say that they feel like that would open the door to problems. But Republicans who support this say there is room here for that to be included, for photo ID to be required of mail-in voters at some point. So they want to go ahead.
All right. SOI@ideastream.org is our email address. I say that now because we're about to talk about property taxes. And usually that gets people talking. The committee to abolish Ohio property taxes is facing a July 1 deadline to gather enough valid signatures to put the issue before voters in November. The number needed, 413,487. I got it, Karen, but it's written down for me. I know you have it memorized. Usually to get that many valid signatures, you need almost double it. In April, the group said it had collected about 305,000. We'll be hearing soon what the number is, the update that we're going to get sometime today. And then they have a big decision to make. What do you think that decision is going to end up being?
Well, I actually have what we know at this point because they made an announcement this morning early. They won't tell us how many signatures they have, but Brian Massey, who's the leader of this committee to abolish Ohio property taxes, or Axe Ohio Tax, says that they don't have 620,000 signatures. That was his goal to submit for this fall's ballot. So the movement to abolish property taxes is continuing to gather signatures, and that issue, that amendment, will not be on this fall's ballot, or they won't even try to make this fall's ballot. They'll aim for November of 2027.
And they can keep those signatures and add to them?
Exactly. If they submitted the signatures this time and they fell short, those signatures would no longer be any good. And so this keeps that alive, though it is worth noting that the longer you gather signatures, the more likely signatures will be invalidated because people move, people die, people are removed from the voter rolls, that sort of thing. So this is an interesting but not entirely unexpected development. Groups that have made the ballot with constitutional amendments in recent memory have done it typically with paid circulators, not just volunteers, and have submitted more than 700,000 signatures.
Now, there's another separate issue on getting something on the ballot, and that involves data centers, which is the other thing we get a whole lot of calls about. Facing same July 1 deadline, where does that effort stand?
Well, I haven't gotten an update from those folks yet. They were way behind because they only started their petition drive in April. So it seems extremely unlikely that they would make the ballot. They are, in some counties, in some places, actually joining up with the Abolish the Property Tax people to kind of have joint signing events, which is interesting because you do have some overlap there between people who support abolishing property taxes and also support banning large data centers. But there is some legislation that may be coming, according to Speaker Matt Huffman. He told reporters this week that he wants to see legislation on data centers and specifically addressing water use, energy use, and that tax break that data centers do get for construction costs, the sales tax break, which is hugely significant. And he wants that legislation to happen next week. And again, lawmakers are planning to go on summer break after next week. So this would be really fast legislation if it moves forward.
All right. Sound of Ideas host Stephanie Haney put together a panel discussion on the issue of data centers on Thursday's show this week. You can find it on the SOI section of our website, the IdeaStream YouTube page, or the podcast provider of your choice. Look for last Thursday's show. Really terrific, covered all the bases show about property taxes. I'm sorry, about data centers. And I also wanted to note, which I failed to do earlier, as we talked about the jail cameras. We'll continue that discussion Tuesday on the Sound of Ideas when Drew Mazius is filling in as the host and Doug Livingston from the Marshall Project is going to be on that show to talk about the cameras. A drive to overturn the Reproductive Rights Amendment passed by voters in 2023 suffered a setback this week when Attorney General Dave Yost rejected the summary language for the amendment. But Karen, it's not an unusual occurrence when this happens.
Oh, no, it happens quite often. Usually the first submission there just doesn't necessarily move forward. And my colleague Joe Ingles talked to one of the organizers behind that, and she said that he told her that there was a small detail that needs to be corrected on the petition and that he plans to revise it and they plan to resubmit this. And this amendment would take out the abortion part of the Reproductive Rights Amendment that voters approved in 2023. And so it would make abortion illegal, or at least allow lawmakers to pass legislation that would make it illegal.
All right. State Senator Bill Blessing, a Cincinnati Republican, wants Ohio to run elections like California. Instead of party primaries, the top two vote getters in a primary, regardless of party, would move on to face each other in the general election. And Karen, Blessing says polarization is driving his push for this, but in heavily Republican Ohio, could it also mean that it's even less of a chance for Democrats in some of these districts?
Oh, sure. And certainly you can look at the way that legislative maps have been drawn for the state house and for congressional districts and point to that the makeup of the House and Senate and Ohio's congressional delegation doesn't really match what we've seen when it comes to, say, presidential votes. But Bill Blessing is an interesting Republican. He's really kind of considered a moderate, even though he definitely sides with Republicans on a lot of social issues. But he's been trying to deal with this issue of polarization. He suggested even expanding the size of the state house to many, many more members, which he said would be a little bit more potentially representative of all of Ohioans. But he's got some ideas here that certainly aren't going to move forward at this point because, again, we're approaching the end of the legislative session at the end of this year. But that's been something that he's been concerned about for quite a while.
All right. Akron is looking to address the city's stray dog problem and overcrowding at animal shelters through a proposed agreement with Summit County Animal Control. So let's talk about this. This happened, by the way, is happening in many animal shelters across the region. Akron can be our focal point now. But let's talk about the issue. Why are rescue groups, particularly in Akron, struggling to meet the community need?
So Akron is particularly an issue, saying that the Summit County Animal Control Shelter 80% of its stray dog population holding comes from Akron. I get that Akron is the biggest city in the county, but that's still a tremendous number. And the city pays the shelter between $15,000 to $50,000 per year to hold the dog. So they say that pays for about 3 days worth of a dog to stay there. And dogs from Akron have been staying there for 500 days or more.
Wow.
So the proposal is to instead pay them annually $1.5 million, a tremendous boost in terms of funding that they're proposing.
But they've got such a need. I mean, these animals are staying
More than
for
a year.
Yeah.
I mean, more than a year, and they're estimated to really need to be there for a few days. So yeah, this is a tremendous proposal. It would be a 2-year contract, and it would give some special access to the local police to the shelter. And the local police officers have been saying things like, the dogs can be particularly aggressive, and they're the ones who have to take the calls, particularly at the kind of off weird hours where, someone from the shelter isn't necessarily always working or as fully staffed. So, the police are having an issue with it as well.
Okay. Well, we're going to take a quick break here. A lot of stories to discuss on the Sound of Ideas Reporters Roundtable in the back half of the show, including a former judge sentenced to jail time. But first, I'm handing it over to Drew Mazias, who's hosting next week on Monday and Tuesday for a look at what's ahead next week on the Sound of Ideas.
Hey, Mike, I'm in the host chair for Stephanie on Monday and Tuesday next week. So here's a look ahead at what's coming up on the Sound of Ideas. Monday, it's our annual summer book recommendation show. Ariel Bibliophiles will be joining us and saying what you should add to your summer reading list. Always a popular show. We want your recommendations as well. SOI@ideastream.org or call in live when we're on the air that day. Tuesday, we're going to talk about an increased prevalence of tick bites in the area and why that number is creeping up so high. And we'll learn more about a Marshall Project investigation looking at broken security cameras at the Cuyahoga County Jail. Wednesday, Stephanie is back in the host seat, and we'll talk about SAD, seasonal affective disorder, and why some people are getting the summer blues this time of year. And Thursday, increased nicotine usage among young people, why some influencers are espousing the benefits of nicotine. We'll separate fact from fiction that day. And now, back to you in the studio, Mike.
Thanks, Drew. You're back with the Sound of Ideas Reporters Roundtable from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm IdeaStream's executive editor, Mike McIntyre, along with Gabriel Kramer and Matt Richman, two of our greatest reporters here, and Karen Kassler at the Columbus State House. Thank you for staying with us. And a reminder that if you keep up on the news and enjoy testing your knowledge, you should try our IdeaStream news quiz. Just came to my inbox before the show today. I haven't had a chance to do it yet. It publishes on Fridays, and you can find it on our homepage at ideastream.org. You then sign up for it, and they can send it to your email every Friday morning. Former First Energy executives Charles Jones and Michael Dowling have been re-indicted on state corruption charges tied to the House Bill 6 scandal, setting the stage for a new trial after a jury deadlocked earlier this year. Karen, we wondered when Dave Yost said he was leaving whether the new AG would seek to continue with this case. Well, just before he leaves, we now have the answer.
Yeah, in fact, I asked him that in our exit interview a couple weeks ago, and he said he wanted his replacement, Andy Wilson, who's going to be the interim attorney general, to make that decision. But yeah, we do know now that there's been a reindictment, and Yost says that there's new facts that are here in the case. There's 22 felony counts overall between Jones and Dowling, and so it looks like that case will go forward. And I think everybody expected that to go forward. I mean, it was so high profile, and there have been so many people who've been involved in this case who have at least been in court or something. And so for this to just be ending with a mistrial that happened a couple weeks ago would be really, I think, kind of surprising.
And these are the state charges, but where do they fit into the overall scheme of prosecutions regarding HB 6?
Well, and that's an important point there. These are state charges. Dowling and Jones do face federal charges as well. And, First Energy, the company, has admitted in a plea deal to bribing Larry Householder, the former Republican Speaker of the Ohio House, and Sam Randazzo, the late chair of the Public Utilities Commission. Larry Householder, of course, in federal prison for 20 years for bribery. Matt Borges, the former chair of the Ohio Republican Party, has been released. He was serving a 5-year sentence in that same trial with Householder. And so it's been a long, long process since all these arrests happened in 2020.
All right. Cleveland Browns, a year after signing superstar Myles Garrett to a lucrative extension and vowing he'd go directly from Cleveland to Canton when he's inevitably inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, was traded. They traded him to the Los Angeles Rams. In return for the single-season NFL sack leader and two-time Associated Press Defensive Player of the Year, the Browns get an all-pro pass rusher, a first-round draft choice next year, a second-rounder in 2028, a third-rounder of the year after that. Immediate fan reaction was sadness and some anger. People wanted a bigger haul, but also a realization that the deal wasn't a bad one for the Browns, for Garrett, nor for the Rams. And of course, Gabe, not everyone felt that way. I saw this quote from Joe Posnanski, sports columnist, been on Sound of Ideas a number of times, on his Substack. He said that everyone's telling him that's how he should be feeling, that, Miles doesn't want to be here and you got pretty good return for it. But he said as a fan, he's feeling, and I quote, bleep this bleeping team.
Yeah.
That's what he wrote.
Yeah. I mean, I'm numb to anything the Browns. I mean, the Browns have done nothing but disappoint me my entire life. So, like, any move they make is just par for the course. But yeah, I mean, I think theoretically on paper, it's a big loss. He's the best defensive player in the NFL. And to lose that guy, certainly your defense is going to struggle. But I think what it says about the team is, one, they were, seemingly committed to having him there, season after season. He had requested a trade last season, and instead he signed a new contract with the team. So they had, he had been seemingly committed to the team. But there's always rumblings. Oh, he wants out of here. He wants traded. He wants to play for a contender. For as good as he is, the Browns are still bad. So, theoretically, the Browns are probably thinking, okay, well, maybe instead of one great player, they need to find a way to get several good players.
It's a rebuild. I mean, you can't
Right.
win a Super Bowl with the greatest defensive player on your team, and that's basically the focal
That's all you
point.
got. Yeah.
So more draft choices. They've had a couple of good years in drafts. It seems to me, and this is the thing we've talked about. We don't talk much about the X's and
Right.
O's of sports, but we've talked about the stadium being built in Brook Park and the whole complex there. It seems to me that all of this is being timed. We get your draft choices. By then, Myles Garrett will be much older, so don't
Yeah.
really worry about that then. This new player is much younger. You're really trying to be good by the time you open in the new facility.
Right. So the commitment is, rather than trying to be good in 2026, let's try to be great in 2029 and 2020 and 2030, whenever the stadium finally finds a way to finish. Because, they've had this commitment to youth. They got a younger, very good defensive end in Jared Verse, who will play the same position as Myles Garrett, and they got some draft picks to go with it. So you kind of wonder as a fan, their commitment to youth on the defensive side of the ball, will there be a commitment to youth on the offensive side of the ball? Perhaps at quarterback as well.
I still remember when he jumped over the entire offensive line and blocked a kick.
Yeah.
Like without
Save the
touching
game.
anybody.
Yeah.
He just jumped.
So there are instances where it's like he won us the game almost single-handedly. But, they only won 5 games last year. So it's only so many times he can really pull it off.
I saw some really bad tweets that said that they've put a bunch of traffic cameras in Los Angeles just in time for Myles Garrett to show up. Apparently, he's had some issues with his driving.
Yeah, he's getting in trouble all the time here and getting speeding tickets, and it's an issue with the team. He hasn't really been too present at off-season activities with the Browns.
Like not there at all.
But immediately with the Rams, he's there, so perhaps he's a little happier. One little side note, his fiancée, Olympic gold medalist Chloe Kim, is a Los Angeles resident. So maybe there's a personal side that we can be happy for Myles Garrett.
So good for Myles Garrett, maybe good for the Browns, certainly good for the Rams, who are trying to go all in and win it this year.
And Garrett did have a nice letter written to the
Real
fans.
classy.
It was classy. It was very nice. So we can appreciate that as well.
Very good. Former Cuyahoga County Domestic Relations Court Judge Leslie Ann Celebrezzi was sentenced to 60 days in jail on Monday, 4 months after pleading guilty to tampering with records, a felony, by steering a case to her docket and posting an entry that made it appear that the assignment was random. And Matt, this is, again, we're talking about the Marshall Project because we talked about Doug Livingston before. This is Mark Puente's reporting, where he's dug into sort of her connection to a particular court-appointed receiver. And a receiver is somebody that you bring in that kind of handles the financials of a divorce and makes some rulings in those kinds of cases. But it's a pretty lucrative deal.
Yeah. If there's a lot of assets, companies and money and like all these things that, during the divorce have to sort of be frozen so nobody is kind of doing shady things with them, they'll bring in a receiver and the receiver starts making all the decisions about how money's spent, what gets sold and all of that. The family relationship between Celebrezzi's family and Mark Dettori goes back to her father. For years, the Marshall Project found that cases from her court were going to him and his daughter, and that resulted in like about $500,000 in fees going to him.
And they were close. The Marshall Project had a photograph that they posted of an investigator taking a picture of the two of them kissing, and she was like, that was a family kiss. Others said it didn't look like that. So there's this an indication that there might have been a little bit more. But the idea is cases were steered to her docket. They should be a random draw. They weren't. Then he is assigned and apparently getting his fees from that, which he's entitled to make. But he gets assigned them from that judge, but the case goes to the judge because she made that happen and said that it was actually following the rules by making it random. That's what the judge who sentenced her had a big problem with, saying we have to be trusted to follow the rules and to be above board on these types of things.
Yeah, yeah. And so she was the administrative judge of the domestic relations court. So when there were assignments made, it went across her desk, and that's supposed to be random, but she could kind of put her thumb on the scale. And she got in quite a bit of trouble with the disciplinary council, the sort of the body that oversees lawyers' conduct and judges' conduct. That's part of the Ohio Supreme Court, and admitted to wrongdoing on I think it was 15 violations of legal ethics, and had her law license suspended and left the bench. And so this has really just been a really enormous downfall for Judge Celebrezzi, or former Judge Celebrezzi.
A judge is supposed to be impartial. So should they endorse candidates for office? Democrats, including former Ohio Supreme Court justices, are backing a resolution urging the Ohio Supreme Court to rule that judges cannot endorse. Karen, this resolution comes out of a recent conduct hearing by the Ohio Supreme Court. What happened there?
Well, it was a disciplinary conduct hearing, and the whole idea of justices and judicial appointees, judicial candidates, endorsing candidates is kind of tough. But we're in Ohio now, a situation where judges for appeals courts and justices for the Ohio Supreme Court do run with partisan labels, and they do run in partisan primaries. So the argument has been that these are partisan candidates at this point. But how do you, as a judge who is being asked to rule and be fair and follow the law and not see party, how are you then going to be trusted to do that? And so this is a resolution that seeks to try to get the Supreme Court to go ahead and put that out there and stop the endorsement of candidates. But it's just a resolution because the legislature can't tell the Supreme Court what to do. So
Right. Would the resolution, assuming it does go anywhere, would it impact party label designations on ballots, which appear to have helped Republicans?
I don't think so. I mean, I know that the lone Democrat in statewide elected office in Ohio, Justice Jennifer Brunner, had sued over that, and I don't think that went anywhere. But there's a lot of concern among Democrats that those party labels have really been a problem. Of course, Republicans have said that, hey, candidates were running in partisan primaries anyway, so why not just go ahead and put that party label on the November ballot? So we'll see what happens this fall. There's 2 seats up. And again, Jennifer Brunner is one of them, and she is the lone Democrat in statewide elected office.
You look really excited right now, Karen, and I think it's not just because the Guardians won a series against the Yankees. I think it's because there's another budget in the works in the state capitol, and that is the capital budget. It isn't the general budget we spent so much time talking about last year. This is for capital project construction, infrastructure. I know you've been digging into it because this is what you geek out on. So tell me, what's in that?
Well, and actually local communities should be pretty excited about this too, because this is the budget that includes a lot of money for local projects. Communities submit their requests for money to state lawmakers, and then lawmakers kind of agree on exactly what they're going to use that money for. It's a $3.7 billion capital budget, $600 million for school building assistance, and then $510 million for local government projects. And then you go down through the whole list. Among those local government projects, for instance, $10 million for East Cleveland. And you also have a total of $346.5 million for behavioral health facilities. Also some money for statewide developmental disability centers and a psychiatric hospital for youth. You've got some money that goes to Ohio State and other colleges and universities around Ohio. Money for prisons. This is where all the money comes from to do construction and do all that kind of stuff.
Is this where the lobbyists are coming into play? Like, they got money for this organization or that project, that type of thing. This is where a lot of that comes into play.
Oh, absolutely. And this is where local officials also come in when they submit to their state representatives and senators, hey, we need this to do something at, say, the Rock Hall. This is the budget that they could get that money from, and they really typically hope that they get at least something. But you can't give everybody everything. That's what lawmakers keep telling us.
$24.1 million for the Ohio State Fair. Does that mean there's going to be new facilities there, or just upgrading of infrastructure?
The Ohio State Fair has been under construction for quite a while, so there's a lot of renovation going on at the Ohio State Fair. So I'm very interested to see what the fair looks like once this is done, because that whole place has just been basically torn down and rebuilt. So it's a big it's a big area. It's a big fairgrounds.
All right. In Cleveland, menacing a healthcare worker on the job is now a first-degree misdemeanor, carrying a minimum sentence of 3 days in jail, a maximum of 30 days, and a $1,000 fine. So, Matt, this is something that City Council passed this week in that marathon session we talked about. How prevalent are the attacks on healthcare workers?
Well, so the CDC found, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention found that healthcare workers make up 10% of the workforce and experienced 48% of the non-fatal injuries from workplace violence. But this law isn't about assaults. This is about menacing. So that's threats. That's the words that you use against healthcare workers. And there's not, the numbers on that are less clear here in Cleveland and nationally. What the CDC says is there's been a 7% rise in reported harassment of healthcare workers between 2018 and 2022.
Boy, a tough enough job. And then you get the harassment on top of that. So council's trying to react to that. But inside council, there's some discussion or disagreement on a couple of things. One is whether the legislation was ever needed, is even needed. And then the second is about bias against those who might then be prosecuted in this law. So tell me about that.
Yeah, so this took a while to get through council, and one of the big concerns that they raised was the big system, University Hospitals and Cleveland Clinic. It's not clear that if you want to report an instance of threats, that you would be able to use work time to say go and file a police report. They said in committee that they have like special sort of classifications in their time cards for this sort of thing. But it was unclear that, there would really be support for workers if they wanted to go in and report it. And, that Metro Health would be the exception. They are the ones who kind of encourage their employees to go and make these reports. And then the second concern was that from some council members that enforcement of this law would fall disproportionately on Black or minority patients.
Stephanie Howes-Jones specifically brought that point up.
Yeah, that there would be things that go on in a hospital room that are kind of, taken out of context, that people would have heightened emotions, and that there would be really difficult times, and people would say things that were delicate, and maybe these increased penalties would lead to more reporting of those kind of having a bad moment type incidents.
And what we heard from the council president is we'll be cautious and judicious.
Yeah. They're hoping to get, when you do the police report, the suspect should get data on the the demographics of whoever these charges are being filed against. So they say they're going to watch that.
There's a new way to pay for Cleveland bus riders. The Regional Transit Authority launched a ticketless payment model effective this week. So how does that work?
So there's essentially two options. There's an app that you can download, EasyFare or the Transit app, and then you can load funds onto that account, and then you'll get a QR code to scan every time you go on a bus or a train, which kind of already exists now. But you can also purchase a smart card, which works the same way as an app, but you can load money onto it and scan it when you use a bus or a train. What's kind of nice about this is that they're kind of lowering the price a little bit. I mean, not lowering the price of a fare, but rather they're putting a cap on how many times it can get scanned in a day. So a day pass is $5, which equates to a round trip, $2.50 for a fare. So after you've used it twice, essentially, you won't be charged again. You can keep riding, whether it's transfers or new rides or whatever.
So it's still good if you wanted to ride all
Yeah.
day and go to various
Yeah,
places.
they just don't charge you past $5.
Can I bring my yogurt container full of quarters? Will that work?
Yeah, feel free. Yeah,
Or I can get
as
one
long
of
as
those
there's no
carts.
yogurt, so just quarters.
The yogurt's gone. We weren't planning to bring this up, but I wanted to mention this building that's an eye-catcher, conversation starter near the Kent, Maine campus where you went to school, Gabe.
Yeah.
It's called the Dome. It's visible off State Route 261. Built in 1978, sits on about an acre of land. It's now for sale. Are you going to buy it?
I'm not gonna buy it. You know, it's funny. 4 years there, I drove entering from Brimfield into Kent. You can't help but notice it. I've never once stepped foot in there. It's been a nightlife space for several decades. Most recently closed. Apparently, most recently, years after I graduated, it billed itself as Kent's only 18 plus LGBTQ plus bar. So kind of neat. Sad to see it go, but who knows what the future holds.
Now it's for sale. It's vacant, less than 200 grand, and I can just see that as like your domicile.
I think it would be great to have a disco ball right at the middle.
I love it. Tomorrow is Blimp Day in Akron. Get ready for the silent air show that will circle the city and hover over every city neighborhood. 2 blimps will take off from Wingfoot Lake in Suffield Township tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. and loop counterclockwise over the city. Blimp Day officials hope will become an annual tradition celebrating the city's rich history with the Goodyear blimp. And Gabe, this is really set up so people have a chance to get a good look at these blimps throughout the city.
Yeah, I mean, you never really know when it's going to be up or where it's going to be up, and now they're dedicating themselves to being there in Akron, and they're going to have a map where they're going to rotate in the sky for half of an hour and then go to another spot for half an hour. And they're going to go counterclockwise, starting in above East Akron, Goodyear Heights, and Ellett, ending at noon between University Park, South Akron, and Coventry Crossing. So if you're in Akron, look up the sky. You'll get a chance on that morning.
I think it was last year at Canal Basin Park, that the mayor gave his state of the city there with the blimps overhead. There were 3 of them,
Yeah.
and everyone they weren't ignoring the mayor, but every time a blimp came by, everybody's looking up and taking pictures.
Yeah.
But it really is a marvel when you see these things go by. It's not just a football game. People are
Yeah.
entranced by these.
Yeah, and if you don't know what the Goodyear blimp is, you probably look at the sky and think, "What is that?" Especially when there's 3 of them just roaming in the sky, like they'll be this coming weekend. But not many things more iconic in Akron than the Goodyear blimp, LeBron James, the Black Keys, and Devo.
Devo, exactly. And we're going to delve into that in a second. But quick, if there's weather tomorrow.
I tried.
I
I'm trying my
appreciate it,
best. I'm
but I
trying my
do
best.
have to. If there's weather tomorrow, what happens? Because I hear there's thunderstorms coming.
It's Ohio, so you never know what's coming. But yeah, they'll have to bring the blimps down and do it another day.
We'll make it a different day. But speaking of days, Devo performed a homecoming concert Wednesday at the Akron Civic Theater. My friend Rich said it was a journey into the past, and our friend Dave Giffels, the Akron professor and author, called it stellar and said it's amazing how much energy they still have. He said their use of video is at its peak. Those are big fans. So are 2 lawmakers, one from Akron, another from Toledo, who want the state to honor the band with its own Devo Day, April 18th. That's the day the band performed its first show in 1973 at Kent State University. You were there, right, Gabe?
I missed that show.
You missed it?
Yeah,
I thought you were at Kent
I
at that
was
time.
not even born yet.
Karen, lawmakers don't really sound like Devo types, but the band seems interested in having a Devo Day.
Come on, you can't see these folks dancing to Whip It or working in a coal mine. Those are the only 2 Devo songs I know.
You're going to learn another one in just a second.
Yeah, but I mean, that this is the thought is that this is a band that really made Ohio its home and Akron specifically, and so why not honor them?
All right. Very good. Karen, good to talk with you today. Matt and Gabe as well. Thanks for being here.
Happy Friday.
Appreciate it. If you missed any part of today's show, you can hear a rebroadcast tonight at 9 on 89.7 WKSU. Find every episode of The Sound of Ideas on the Reporters Roundtable wherever you get your podcast and on the IdeaStream Public Media YouTube page. You can get the last word on today's topics by sending an email to soi@ideastream.org. And I'm Mike McIntyre. I hope you stay safe and have a great weekend. We mentioned our local love of Devo, and our last story was Blimp Day in Akron before that. But there aren't any songs by Devo about blimps. There is, however, a blimp connection. Devo made a video of their 1981 song Beautiful World featuring the Goodyear blimp and its pilots a few years back. And let me tell you, the blimp captains look cool wearing the energy domes.